The one thing that I think we should do, but I imagine there is zero chance of Keir Starmer doing, is we should extend membership of the Commonwealth to one particular country, which is Ukraine.
I think we would have left, though. Jeremy Corbyn was never a rejoiner and may in fact have been a not very secret Eurosceptic.
I find this incredibly difficult because I am culturally deeply reactionary. Welcome to Quite Right Questions and Answers. And this week, Maddie and I will be debating the Commonwealth and its future. Is it still relevant to the world in which we live? We'll be fantasising, if that's the right word, about what life would have been like if Jeremy Corbyn had won in 2019. And Maddie will be telling me about one of the greatest stories ever told, as we discuss what is the truly important work of art that was created in the 21st century.
Our first question comes from James Kibera. With Brexit and pushback in general against immigration, what should be the view of Britain on the Commonwealth and expanding it like was done with Rwanda? Do we have a global set of values that others find attractive? What do we need to overcome to embrace the current embarrassment of past greatness?
I think it's such a fascinating question, the Commonwealth. I know that there are a few aspects of domestic or foreign policy less fashionable than the Commonwealth. It's seen as, by some, as a rather embarrassing relic of our imperial past, an attempt to try to dignify colonialism with a veneer of modern relevance. By others, it's seen as an ill-assorted group of countries united only by their desire to try to shake down the wealthier members of this family of nations, particularly the UK. But to my mind, it does have value because I think that there are certain things, and it's not overstraining it, to say that Commonwealth countries either have or aspire to. And whether or not it's because of our common law traditions, or whether or not it's because of a particular approach towards, if not democracy in all its aspects, democracy as a broad virtue, there is merit in it. And I don't think that groups of nations need to be defined either solely by geographical proximity, like the EU, or purely by one aim, NATO defence. They can be united by a broad set of values, even if it's not easy to pin them down in a sort of charter of, 120 words.
I think there are great potential opportunities with the Commonwealth, but my frustration is that I think we are currently led by people who do not have our national interest at heart and therefore cannot be trusted to look for potential opportunities. Right now, we almost have the worst of all possible worlds with the Commonwealth. We have some of the disadvantages. Weirdly, for example, we allow Commonwealth citizens to vote in our elections, even if that's not reciprocated. That seems pretty crazy to me. I would say such voting rights ought to at least be reciprocal. But we also don't accrue any of the so-called soft power benefits that some might argue would derive from that relationship. For example, we're often asked by countries which themselves take vast sums of money from China to stump up reparations money, even at a time when we're pretty broke ourselves. This suggests to me that the soft power benefits have not really materialised. I do think that there's both a need and an opportunity, and it's why it's such a shame that I cannot trust the people that gave us the Chagos deal and the particular Mandarin class that occasionally, as in the case of Gus O'Donnell, come out with things like, my job is to maximise global welfare.
Yes.
Not national. I mean, we're not asking for a kind of Bismarck, Palmerston level diplomacy, but just the vaguest bit of national interest would be nice, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. If only we had a Bismarck or a Palmerston. That would be fantastic. But you're right. We needn't even have great men like that in order to have a foreign policy that does think about putting the nation first, and also that recognises that this nation will have ties and values, which make certain countries natural allies, and certain countries which we have a relationship with, an historic relationship with, we should be able to talk to on terms of greater intimacy, even if we don't always agree. And that is part of the strength of the Commonwealth. And to be fair to the French, they do have a very hard-headed approach through their organisation, Francophonie, of French-speaking nations that have been part of either of their empire or part of their broader family. And that approach does work. I mean, there are problems with it, of course, but it does work on the basis of a common alignment of interests. It's striking that at one point, I don't know where things are now, there was some talk of francophonie extending to the Republic of Ireland. I think this was at the sort of high point of sort of, Brexit fever. And the whole point was, even though, of course, it was a dagger pointed at the heart of the British Isles in the broadest sense, it was also an example of, to be fair to the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Office, the way in which they're not ashamed to use their power in order to generate mischief and in order to think about the community of interest that they represent.
I do still find it quite funny that at the same time that we were doing all of this debasement and self-flagellating, at the time of the Paris Olympics, the surfing tournament was held in the French territory of Tahiti. Do you know what France's longest geographical border is with which country?
No.
It's Brazil, French Guiana.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's astonishing to me. And then, as you say, I think your point about the francophonie is really important because actually it's in the Anglosphere or the Anglophone countries in Africa, for example, where there has been more Chinese expansion.
Yes.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and perhaps with our reticence, we've really taken our eye off the ball. And I feel like there are opportunities, and it needn't be through migration and visas, but there may be mutual areas of where we could support each other and share the same priorities. For example, Nigeria sees itself as the first great power of Africa, or would like to be. Is there something? Might we, for example, help Nigeria with rooting out Islamist terrorists in the north of that country? You know what I mean? There are these sorts of questions.
I couldn't agree more. And the French, I mean, I think they've probably gone too far, but they've had no compunction in deploying troops, intervening in French West Africa and elsewhere. Now, that's created a pushback, and there are countries like Burkina Faso where there's been a profound rejection at the moment of French involvement. Still the case, however, that in Burkina Faso, the banknotes that are published, the sort of West African franc, are still printed in France. It's still the case that the relationships on multiple levels exist. I do think, without either being hag-ridden by guilt about the imperial past, or for that matter, without wanting to be overly paternalistic, have those ties, linguistic, legal, political, and educational, that can work to the benefit of both. And I think you're particularly right in areas like defence and in dealing with terrorism. There's an opportunity. Talking of defence, the one thing that I think we should do, but I imagine there is zero chance of Keir Starmer doing, is we should extend membership of the Commonwealth to one particular country, which is Ukraine. We should say that our values, our belief in democracy, our belief that when countries have their integrity threatened, that we stand together, whatever Russia's view of NATO may be, whatever the long-term membership prospects that Ukraine may have within the EU, nothing should prevent Ukraine being a part of the Commonwealth. And I think, judging from the relationship that he's had with Zelensky and from the position that the king himself has taken on it, I can't see that he, or those close to him, would object to something which I think would be a very decisive way of using soft power in a positive fashion to promote democracy. Our next question comes from Daniel Brown, and he asks, do you think there's a case to be made that the country would be in a better place now if Corbyn had won in 2019?
That's such an interesting question. These sorts of counterfactuals are always difficult to answer, aren't they? But I think that the number one thing is that if Corbyn had won in 2019, he would obviously have been in charge throughout lockdown. So you have to consider what Jezza lockdown would have looked like. I think in some ways it might have been his particular wing of the Labour Party is very concerned with civil liberties. So actually during lockdown, you got this very strange alliance of people within Parliament. You would often find the only people voting against some draconian lockdown restriction were the Libertarians of the Tory party and the Jezza wing of Labour. So I think you would have seen perhaps a total resistance to anything like vaccine passports, for example, or forced vaccinations. But I think there would have been also a great capacity for chaos. I suspect that schools would have closed for longer because Jeremy Corbyn and his team would have been unable to, they would have simply exceeded with whatever the teaching unions wanted. And I don't think we would have had the vaccine rollout that we did, because I can't see Jeremy Corbyn empowering someone like Kate Bingham to do what she did. So I think it would have been a mixed bag, more chaotic. But I suppose one of the potential upsides of that is that you then wouldn't get a Keir Starmer government, because apart from, to my knowledge, there's a few examples, but very, very few incumbent governments that were in charge during lockdown survived the next election. Almost all of them were turfed out. And then there were weird anomalies like Canada, which kind of Mark Carney was able to slink back in large part because of Trump and his pronouncements on tariffs, which completely doomed Pierre Poilievre. So we probably then wouldn't have had a Keir Starmer, and then we would have then been looking at probably a Conservative Party led by Boris Johnson, if his personal life hadn't got in the way, taking over post-lockdown. And I'm not sure if that would be better than what we're seeing now.
No.
What do you think?
I think it's impossible to know because there are so many variables. But I think you light on a number of interesting avenues. So would a naturally civil libertarian, radical left government have taken a very different approach towards COVID? Or might it have been the case that Corbyn and those in government with him would have been as, I hesitate to say as deferential, but certainly as allied with the view of Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance and others.
Which were quite changeable views themselves.
Well, yes, they were. I think that it's probably the case that almost any government, unless it was one that was led by a very rock-ribbed libertarian like a sort of Steve Baker, would have implemented broadly similar policies. Again, if we look at Europe, whatever you think of it, most European nations went down that path. Would we have had a very different Brexit? I think we would have left the European Union, but I think it would have been a different type of Brexit. Would it have been a more enduring settlement? I don't know. What we would, I'm sure,
I think we would have left though. Jeremy Corbyn was never a rejoiner, and may in fact have been secret
European. I think again, if we assume that there had been that victory, I think what would have happened is that Jeremy Corbyn would have gone back. He would have said, Boris Johnson's deal we need to renegotiate parts of, but I think that he would have honoured the vote to leave, and I think that it's certainly the case that in his heart, and certainly in the hearts of some of the people around him, like Seamus Milne, he was a Brexiteer. And I think he would have felt that going into the election saying that he would get a better deal and then reneging on that by taking us fully back in, I think would have been the end of him. I think the broader challenge would have been, whatever the nature of Brexit, dealing with COVID, dealing with the economic damage that it wreaked, dealing with the war in Ukraine, I think it's undoubtedly the case that we would have been overall in a weaker economic position. And it's also the case, dealing with the war in Ukraine, that a Jeremy Corbyn-led government would not have been the strong ally of Ukraine that Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have proven. I also think it's the case that the anti-Semitism that was running rampant in the party, which Jeremy Corbyn had not done enough to check, if Labour had won, I think that would have been a portent of a darker time for not just Britain's Jewish population, but for those who were, for whatever reason, out of favour at any given time with the hard left overall. So I don't think that any Corbyn administration would have been long-lived. Would that have meant, therefore, that we would have seen a resurgent Conservative Party come back in post the Corbyn period to steer the country in a better direction? One would hope so, but one can't know. And my natural small c caution is, when you've got someone as potentially dangerous and as unfit for a high office as Corbyn, just don't take the risk.
I suppose the economics of it would have been probably the biggest difference.
It would certainly been fun to sketch.
Yeah. Although actually, weirdly, Corbyn, not that great to sketch. maybe it's because I have a slight soft spot for him. I can't stick the knife into Jeremy Corbyn. But also, he's kind of humorless, but it's not funny in the way that Starmer is humorless, but deeply funny. There's a kind of priggishness, which I find really very inherently very, very funny. Whereas I think Corbyn is kind of not in on the joke, but you don't get the sense that he'd be so offended by people's mockery as Keir Starmer would. So actually, from a professional perspective, I just have to be glad that Keir Starmer's lot got in as they did in 2024.
So if there is anyone who's listening who is nostalgic to the idea of Corbyn winning in 2019 and who would like a hard left government, then other hard left leaders are available, and Zach Polanski, I'm sure, would welcome your call.
Our final question comes from Anonymous. I really enjoyed the poll in the art section, and so I would love to know, in your view, what's the greatest artwork of the century so far?
I find this incredibly difficult because I am culturally deeply, deeply reactionary. But I would say that the greatest living composer in the United Kingdom at the moment is James Macmillan. And therefore, I would choose the specially commissioned work that was played at the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, which is Who Shall Separate Us? It's a composition for an 8-part choir. It's an a cappella composition. It was first performed at Westminster Abbey to accompany the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. I could have chosen other works by James Macmillan. He seems to me to be transparently the most powerful and the most beautiful composer of music in the UK today. I should also give an honourable mention to a chap whom others may not have heard of called Paul Mealer, who was also responsible for the music that was played at the wedding of the Prince of Wales and Catherine. And his work was known to both of them from the time that he spent at St Andrews.
I have to say I'm woefully ignorant. I mean, probably I wish my knowledge of classical music itself were better, but when it comes to modern classical, I'm even more hopeless. So thank you for the recommendations. Yes, I think so. When this century, this does mean it's not the last 100 years. It's from
I think it's
from
exactly.
2000. Yeah.
I think dated from 1st January 2000.
Which I found. I mean, I'm probably more of a reader than I am of a classical music expert. There is something funny. I don't know about you because I know you love classical music, but did you ever learn to play an instrument or anything like that?
I did. I'm not very good. I'm a terrible singer. I love singing, but I'm terrible. And I played the tuba.
Did you?
Yes.
That's a rogue choice.
There was when I was at primary school in Aberdeen, it was then the case that there was a peripatetic music service, and the choice was either the oboe or the tuba. I chose the oboe, but there were no oboes available, which may well be the title of the first volume of my memoirs. And so I learnt to play the tuba very badly.
I know. My mother did try. She was keen for us to have opportunities to try all sorts of different things, and some of them stuck and some of them didn't. My brother and I were always much better at sport and particularly bad at music. I think it took us several years to get to grade 1 piano. But I do love classical music, but in a way I can't explain what's great about it other than I love it. Like I love the Rachmaninoff piano concerto will put, shivers up my spine. It's so beautiful, but I can't give you any insightful commentary as to why it's so.
Can't.
Do you know what I mean?
No.
Yeah.
Again, this is one of the things that when I'm asked why I like particular pieces of music, even though I'm naturally inclined to expatiate on any subject at length at the drop of a hat, music is one of the subjects where I feel totally out of my depth in terms of explaining why.
Yes.
I can express enthusiasm.
I'm exactly the same.
But what I can't do is analyze or convince. I think that you either will love anything that I might recommend or not. You can build up a sense of the types of things that one might like on the basis of recommendations and building up through osmosis a sense of what someone's overall taste is. But what I don't have is the ability that great critics, including Spectator critics, have of being able to convince. I mean, I'm in awe, was in awe in particular, of critics like Michael Tanner, used to be the Spectator opera critic, now sadly deceased, who could illuminate music criticism in a way that was gripping, intellectually intelligible to someone like me. But while the Spectator's critics can do that, I certainly can't.
I know the feeling.
And your
books, I'm probably on firmer ground with books, but I think about this, and I can give you a few favourite books that have been written since 2000. But again, I mostly read older stuff, so I don't know if I'm particularly qualified. I mean, a few that stand out to me would be The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I think the Wolf Hall trilogy is completely amazing. The one initially I thought of was the Empire trilogy by J.G. Farrell, but then I remembered that that's way back. That's probably from the 70s. But to me, that's a very modern book because I tend to go for much older reading material. So for me, I'm going to pick a film if that's allowed. I think it's the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Peter Jackson, a work of absolute genius, a masterpiece. It's astonishing on so many different levels. I think in terms of storytelling, like, it puts me in mind, it's Wagnerian, it's the Gesamtkunstwerk, it's the total work of art. It's astonishing to me that you have basically every form of special effect there. You also have really complicated practical effects. So the detail that goes into the making of, for example, Gondor, the city, the way that CGI is used not to take the place of practical effects, but generally to enhance them, which is exactly how CGI ought to be used. And many films from that period that have gone way too far with CGI have aged terribly as a result, like the early Star Wars prequels, terrible for this. These are masterpieces which have held up perfectly. And I think if you're a music lover, I can't think of a better soundtrack of the last 30 years or so.
I think that they are gripping pieces of cinema. They're conceived on a truly epic scale. They're clearly directed by someone who had not just a respect for, but a deep immersion and an affection for the books. I know that Tolkien can sometimes be a Marmite taste. I know that there are people who are inclined to deprecate it and to say, there are some people who would argue that the whole idea of fantasy, and in particular Tolkien, is designed for or appeals to the adolescent in all of us. I disagree.
Outrageous. Do they say the same about Paradise Lost?
No. Most of them won't have read it. I think that it's a patronising misunderstanding of a powerful piece of literature. I agree with you that literature that's often dismissed as genre can actually be every bit as great, and that you wouldn't. Well, some people would dismiss, Wilkie Collins as crime or horror or whatever. He's a great 19th century novelist. Other people would, I think, have dismissed Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale as sci-fi. But it's still, its lessons, I think, have been misapplied in some respects, but it's still a brilliant novel and fully realised vision.
Not everywhere is Gilead.
No.
But
Lord of the Rings has, I think, epic qualities and brought to life on screen with some amazing performances. I think Ian McKellen, obviously playing Gandalf, is gripping, but also I think that the depiction of, you mentioned Gondor, the way in which the politics of how you resist evil is depicted both for the residents of Gondor and for the residents of Rohan, the kingdom which is in the grip of Grima Wormtongue, the advisor who has seduced the king into to torpor and decay. The applications of those lessons resonate, and the reason that they resonate is that, notwithstanding the fact that these are fictional kingdoms, that there are recognizable human archetypes and recognizable moral dilemmas that are there. And it's also striking that when you look at some of the tech bros or even some of the European leaders like Giorgia Meloni of the moment, Tolkien's had an impact.
Yeah.
And is having an impact on their thinking. Some people will, again, attack Tolkien because they won't necessarily agree with Peter Thiel or Giorgia Meloni's world outlook. But you can't deny the influence of an artist, a novelist like Tolkien, because he's inhabiting and haunting the imagination of the modern mind.
Yeah. And I think that the reason that the film adaptations are so magnificent is that you can tell that they were made by people with a profound reverence for the source material, which is not always the case in modern adaptations. The fact that there are little Easter eggs for readers of Tolkien who particularly adore the books, and including scenes that are kind of fan favourites in the film. I think maybe they were right not to include Tom Bombadil, but no. But with that in mind, with that aside, I always love the scene with Galadriel taking her leave of the Fellowship. She gives Gimli a lock of her hair, which is a kind of fan favourite, and which I think is included in the film, at least the director's cut, which is a whole different ballgame, frankly. But I think the only way to really enjoy that film. The thing that I really think it's a work of genius is the fact that the attention to detail is remarkable. Yes. It's absolutely astonishing. For example, in the soundtrack, did you know that every particular race of Middle Earth has the soundtrack for those sections, a theme, but also particular instruments that are more associated with that race. So for the hobbits, I think it's woodwind. The men, it's strings. And then when they're in the final battle, they mix up these themes. So they will have the theme for one race being played in the instruments of another. Obviously, this is the kind of thing that I had to have an expert on music who once pointed this out to me. It's not the kind of thing that we muggles can, to borrow another fantasy, can really notice. But that level of attention to detail does not happen unless you are completely in love with your source material. And I wish that some of the more recent adaptations could take that to heart a bit. Part of the reason I love these films so much is because I think something profoundly shifted in adaptation not long afterwards. So in a way, they're kind of some of the last works of great genius that we have before the world changed.
I think that's probably true. And I think that it's also the case that you can have a new generation watching them, familiar with an allegedly more sophisticated means of either adapting classics or producing new films that still fall in love with them. My children, as I say, are in their 20s. They first came across these films 10 years ago, but they remain fans of them, my son in particular. And it was the films that led him into reading, but it's also the case that he would happily watch them now. In fact, I think we watched The Two Towers together just 18 months ago or so. So they don't date. They are of their time, but they don't date.
And they're of their time precisely because they are not trying to hit you over the head with a overt message, because they're not trying to deconstruct the film from within. No. They're not being sarcastic and self-referential. It's just a beautifully told hero's journey with these traditional virtues being demonstrated in quite an earnest way. But we very rarely get that kind of earnestness anymore in cinematic output.
No. One final thing, you mentioned some of your favourite writers and favourite books of the last century, or rather of this century and the last 25 years. I'll mention one author, not a Brit. I think that the finest writer, fine is perhaps the wrong word, the most impressive writer of fiction in the last 25 or more years is Michel Houellebecq. There are many people who find his books and his worldview revolting. His most famous novel, Atomized, was written just before the year 2000. But other novels, The Map and the Territory, Submission, his most recent, Annihilation, have all been published in the last 2 decades. He's very French. He has a very bleak view of humanity.
Men especially.
Men especially. But I do think that there are very few, though again readers may disagree, there are very few British writers who grapple with ideas, bring them to life, sometimes horrific life, in quite the way that Houellebecq does, that have that unity of vision. There are writers of thrillers, Mick Herron, the writer of the Slow Horses series, who I think are brilliant of their time and who will be read, I suspect, many decades to come. But I don't know, maybe it is the case with Wolf Hall, but I don't know of many novels of the first couple of decades of this century written in English, written by Brit authors, that will endure in the way that I'm convinced that Houellebecq will a century hence.
I think one question that's slightly up in the air is the extent to which Houellebecq will, in hindsight, just how prophetic he will seem to be.
Yes, well, I think already he has been.
The reason I actually Houellebecq didn't occur to me at all, but now you mention him, I mean, I was very surprised. I think it's Platform which talks explicitly about Islamist terrorism.
Yes.
I read that quite recently. I was amazed by how long ago it was written, given how prescient that now seems to be. I think it was written in the 90s, maybe, or maybe early noughties. Submission is a fascinating book because it kind of anticipates what we're seeing all around us right now, which is the very bizarre alliance between the progressive left and the Islamists. Exactly. Although his view is slightly different. It's not that they're... there's partly a question of political expediency as to why it is that these progressives end up really quite enjoying the Islamist dictatorship that they're living in. But I think he slightly puts it down to, in a classically French way, the sort of sleazy sexual politics.
Yes, and he anticipated the rise of the Gilets jaunes and the disaffection of the working class in France from the elites, in fact, across Europe. And, of course, his latest novel deals with the dignity of the aged, assisted dying and suicide, as well as eco-terrorism. But it's not just a commentary on some of the issues of our time. It's also a look at what Western man and woman are like in a world deprived not just of the consolations, but also of the challenge of faith. And as I say, he can sometimes be repellent. He can sometimes be hilarious.
And quite repetitive.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But it is brilliant.
I love Houellebecq, but I do struggle to remember. I've enjoyed all of his that I've ever read, but I struggle to differentiate between them.
Oh, no.
There are some very recurring tropes: sex work, prostitution, Islamism. There's often a man who's isolated in a kind of sort of existential way, a sort of horny Proust or Camus type figure. There's often a woman who inexplicably seems to like this ghastly human being and gives him an opportunity, but it never ends well.
No, you're right. But then I suppose I would say that only the most dedicated Dickens lover would be able to tell the difference between your Myrtles, your Veneerings, and your Barnacles, and which appeared in which novel and who did what to whom. However...
I don't know. I mean, Paul Dombey, Tiny Tim.
However, Dickens was immersed in the issues of his time and a great writer and a great human comedian, in the best sense of the word. And so is Michel Houellebecq. But if you are going to read Houellebecq this Christmas, then I absolutely recommend that you follow it quickly afterwards with listening to James Macmillan and then watching Lord of the Rings, all 3 films in relatively quick succession, because the James Macmillan will calm you and the Lord of the Rings will cheer you.
If you'd like to submit your questions for Quite Right next week, you can do so at spectator.co.uk/Quite Right.